The train screeched to a halt on the dusty platform of a quiet frontier town, the late sun casting long shadows across the wooden station. People bustled about, but his eyes searched for only one face. Daniel stood tall and weathered, his frame broad from years of working the land, his hands scarred from rope and plow. For months he had written letters, pouring out words that he could not speak aloud, and now she was here. But as the passengers stepped down one by one, his heart sank when he saw her. Clara descended the steps slowly, her bonnet casting a shadow that failed to conceal the marks along her cheekbone. The fabric of her dress, once carefully chosen for this new chapter of life, hung loose and wrinkled. She clutched her satchel like a lifeline, trembling, eyes darting as if she expected someone to come after her. For a moment Daniel could not move. This was not the bright-eyed young woman he had imagined from ink and paper, but something deeper stirred inside him, something protective, fierce. He approached, his boots crunching against the wooden planks, and when she finally raised her eyes to meet his, shame and fear flickered within them. Her lips parted as though she wanted to explain, to apologize for the state she was in, but no words came. The silence pressed heavily between them, filled only by the chatter of strangers and the distant call of a horse. Daniel saw her bruises, the way she winced when a man brushed past her too roughly, and suddenly the letters she had never finished, the ones where her words seemed to trail into silence, made sense. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. He didn't ask, he didn't hesitate. Something in his tone cracked the wall of fear she had built inside herself. Clara swallowed hard, her grip tightening on her satchel. For a moment she thought of running, as she had always run when things became unbearable, but she found her feet moving toward him. He held out his arm, not grabbing her, not forcing, simply offering. Tentatively, she slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, and the world around her shifted. They walked through the station together, her head lowered to avoid the stares of strangers. Daniel said nothing more until they reached his wagon. He lifted her satchel with ease, setting it beside the seat, then offered his hand to help her up. She hesitated, staring at his calloused fingers, but saw no malice there, only patience, only strength. When she finally let him help her, the touch was gentle, careful not to jar the hidden injuries that marred her arms. As the wagon rattled down the dusty trail toward the open plains, Clara's breath grew unsteady. The silence stretched, and with each mile, she felt the weight of her past pressing down on her chest. She thought of the man who had struck her, the one who had claimed her as his before she fled in desperation to answer Daniel's letters. Shame burned inside her, but beside her Daniel's presence felt like a shield against the memory of cruel hands. The ranch appeared on the horizon, vast fields stretching toward the mountains, a modest home built with care and sweat. Horses grazed in the distance, and the scent of grass and earth drifted in the air. Clara's eyes filled with tears she fought to hide. She had never belonged anywhere, never been welcomed without suspicion or scorn. Yet Daniel guided the wagon forward as though this place was already hers. When he helped her down, she felt her knees tremble beneath her weight. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said, his voice softer now, but still unbreakable. Not anymore. Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the bruises on her skin would fade and that the bruises inside her heart might one day heal. The house stood before her like a promise, sturdy and warm against the wide, lonely land. She took a step forward, her breath unsteady, but her spirit reaching for hope she had thought long lost. Daniel watched her, his jaw tight with resolve. He had asked for a companion, a partner to share his solitude. What had arrived was something far greater, a wounded soul carrying burdens heavier than her small frame should bear. And though he had spoken only 4 words to her, inside him burned a vow he would never break. She would never face harm again, not while he had breath left in his body. Clara glanced back at him, uncertainty clouding her eyes, but for the first time in years, a flicker of safety glimmered within them. She turned toward the house, her steps slow but sure, and Daniel followed, silent as the earth beneath them, steady as the mountains watching from afar. The long road of healing had only begun, but neither of them walked it alone anymore. The train's whistle echoed across the small frontier town, carrying with it a sound both shrill and sorrowful, as though it bore the weight of all the travelers it ferried across the lonely plains. On the wooden platform, townsfolk bustled about, some greeting relatives, others selling wares, a few simply lingering to watch the arrivals. But one man stood apart, tall and weathered, his posture stiff with a tension that had been mounting for weeks. Daniel Harwood, a rancher known for his solitude, had never expected to be here, waiting like a young boy for someone he had never truly seen. Yet here he stood, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the train as though it might carry his fate. For months, he had corresponded through careful, deliberate letters with a woman who lived states away. In her handwriting, he had found something that eased his loneliness, honesty, humor, and glimpses of a spirit that refused to be broken by the hardships she faced. He had offered her a new beginning, a life on his ranch where they might both find purpose in each other. When the passengers began to descend, his heart beat faster. He scanned each face, searching, expecting perhaps a shy smile, a timid wave, the warmth of recognition. Instead, his breath caught in his chest when he saw her. Clara stepped off the train slowly, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching a small satchel that looked too heavy for her fragile frame. Her bonnet was tilted low, as though to shield her from the sun, or perhaps the eyes of others. Yet no shadow could hide the faint bruising across her cheek, the yellow and purple bloom that told of cruelty. The dress she wore hung loosely, wrinkled and weary from travel, and her posture carried a tension that spoke of fear. Daniel froze. For a moment, disappointment stabbed at him, not at her, but at the realization that life had carved into her far more than she had let on in her letters. He had imagined her weary from travel, perhaps nervous, but not broken. And yet, as she stepped onto the platform, swaying slightly as though bracing for something unseen, his chest tightened with a surge of protectiveness. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time, they met. Clara's gaze flickered with shame, as though she expected him to turn away in disgust or regret. Instead, Daniel stepped forward, his boots striking the planks with steady rhythm, each step an anchor to the promise he had made when he invited her here. "You're coming with me," he said. The words were simple, but his voice carried a resolve that left no room for doubt. Clara hesitated, the satchel clutched tighter against her chest, her lips parting as if to argue, to explain, perhaps to confess some sin she believed would drive him off. But no words came. Something in his tone, quiet but unyielding, slipped past her walls. For so long, men's voices had been commands, threats, or cruel jests. His was different. His was a promise. Daniel extended his arm, not to seize her, but to offer. For several seconds that felt eternal, she remained frozen. Then, as if her body betrayed her mind, she slipped her hand lightly into the crook of his elbow. The station seemed to fade as they walked together toward his wagon. Every movement she made was hesitant, wary, as though she expected him to snap at her for walking too slowly, for not holding herself upright, for existing in her fragile state. Yet Daniel said nothing more. He loaded her small satchel onto the wagon as though it were priceless treasure, then offered his hand once more to help her up. She stared at his fingers, scarred and strong from years of work, then placed her own trembling hand in his. His grip was careful, not pressing against the bruises that mottled her skin. He lifted her easily onto the seat beside him. The wagon jolted forward with the horse's first step, and Clara flinched at the motion. Daniel glanced at her, noting the way she clutched the seat's edge, her knuckles pale with tension. The silence stretched between them as the town shrank behind, replaced by open land. Rolling plains stretched endlessly, dotted with wildflowers and distant cattle. The sun dipped lower, painting the world gold. "You don't have to say anything yet," Daniel said at last, his voice breaking the silence. "You're safe now. That's enough." Clara swallowed, staring down at her lap. Safe. The word felt foreign, almost dangerous to believe. How many times had she thought herself safe, only for the rug to be pulled away, leaving her more broken than before? She wanted to cling to his words, but fear clutched her ribs. As the wagon rolled on, she risked glancing at him. His profile was rough, carved by years of hard labor. A strong jaw dusted with stubble, sun-browned skin, eyes steady on the road ahead. He was not handsome in the polished way of city men, but there was something reassuring about his presence, something solid, like the earth itself. She noticed the small details, the way his hands held the reins firmly but not harshly, the way he leaned slightly forward as though always prepared for the unexpected. The journey stretched into quiet miles, and with each one, Clara's grip loosened slightly. By the time the ranch appeared on the horizon, her heartbeat had steadied, though the bruises under her dress ached with every bump in the road. The Harwood Ranch sprawled before them, modest yet strong, built from years of patience and toil. Fences stretched wide, corralling horses and cattle. A barn stood tall, its roof repaired in patches, speaking of a man who fixed what was broken rather than discarding it. The house itself was plain but sturdy, its wooden beams weathered yet warm under the fading sun. Clara's breath hitched. She had never had a home, not truly. The houses she had lived in were cages, places of survival, never belonging. This place, though humble, seemed to hold something different. Daniel stopped the wagon and climbed down, then turned to help her. Again, his hand was steady, his grip careful. When her feet touched the earth, her knees trembled. She took in the ranch with wide eyes, torn between awe and the dread that it might be taken from her at any moment. "You don't have to be afraid here," Daniel said softly. His voice, though quiet, seemed to resonate with the strength of a vow. Not anymore. The tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. She blinked rapidly, willing them away, unwilling to appear weak. Yet something inside her loosened at his words, something that had been knotted tight for years. Inside the house, Daniel showed her the small parlor, the simple kitchen, the stairs that led to 2 bedrooms. "This one's yours," he said, opening the door to a modest room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the fields. He set her satchel on the bed and stepped back, giving her space. Clara touched the quilt that covered the bed, her fingers trembling. No one had ever prepared a place for her before. She turned, lips parting, wanting to thank him, but her throat closed up. Instead, she nodded, her eyes shining. That night, Daniel left her to rest, retreating to his own room. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her body sore from travel, her heart torn between fear and a fragile thread of hope. She replayed his words over and over, "You're coming with me. You don't have to be afraid here." The bruises on her skin would take weeks to fade. The bruises inside her, those might take a lifetime. But as she listened to the steady creak of the old house settling in the night, she felt something she had not felt in years, the faintest whisper of safety. And though she did not yet know how to trust it, she wanted to try. The morning light poured across the plains like liquid gold, spilling through the small window of Clara's room. She stirred awake, her body heavy from both exhaustion and a rest deeper than she'd known in years. For the first time, she hadn't slept with one eye open. The bruises on her ribs still throbbed when she moved, but the silence of the ranch was gentle, not the silence that came before a storm. She rose carefully, pulling on her dress, and paused to stare out the window. Horses grazed in the fields, their tails flicking lazily. The barn door stood ajar, and she could see Daniel moving within, his strong frame silhouetted against the light. He worked with unhurried precision, every motion deliberate. Something stirred in her chest, an ache she couldn't quite name. She pressed her fingers against the glass, reminding herself that this wasn't a dream. She was here. She was free, at least for now. When she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was already seated at the table, a plate of biscuits and eggs before him. Another plate had been set across from him, though he didn't look up when she entered. He seemed to understand that staring might frighten her. "You should eat," he said simply, pushing the plate toward her. Clara hesitated, the chair creaking softly as she sat. She hadn't expected kindness, not without a price. For so long, food had been a bargaining chip, withheld or thrown down with contempt. She lifted her fork slowly, watching him for any sign that he would change, that this gentleness was only a mask. But he ate quietly, not pressing her, not demanding conversation. After a few bites, warmth spread through her belly, and a tear slipped unbidden down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, ashamed, but Daniel's gaze remained steady, not unkind. "You don't have to explain," he said softly. "Not until you're ready." The words caught her off guard. Men in her past had always demanded explanations, justifications, excuses. His patience unsettled her almost as much as his strength. She nodded faintly, lowering her gaze back to the plate. The days that followed moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of ranch life. Daniel tended the cattle, repaired fences, and rode out across the pastures, while Clara helped in small ways she could manage, washing dishes, mending torn fabric, sweeping the floors. She kept to herself, her movements careful, but gradually, the quiet of the ranch began to wrap around her like a balm. At night, she would sit by the window of her room, staring at the vast stretch of stars, the silence so complete it seemed to breathe. And in those moments, she began to feel the walls inside her trembling, as though they might finally give way. One evening, Daniel found her outside, standing near the fence, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun melted into shades of fire and rose. He approached quietly, leaning against the post beside her. "You like the sunsets," he said. She nodded. "They don't end with shouting," she whispered before she could stop herself. Her voice cracked, and she quickly turned her face away, ashamed of the confession. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked out at the horizon with her, sharing the silence until her shoulders eased. As weeks passed, Clara's bruises faded, but the deeper wounds lingered. She startled easily at sudden noises. If Daniel moved too quickly, she shrank back before realizing he meant no harm. Yet each time, he steadied her with patience, never mocking, never forcing. One morning, she ventured into the barn, drawn by the sound of horses. Daniel was brushing down a chestnut mare, his hands moving in slow circles along its coat. Clara lingered at the doorway, the scent of hay and leather filling her senses. "She's beautiful," she murmured, surprising even herself by speaking first. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the horse. "Her name's Willow. Gentle as they come. You can come closer if you'd like." Clara hesitated, but the mare's calm eyes drew her forward. Daniel handed her the brush, his fingers barely grazing hers, careful not to startle. "Like this," he said, guiding her hand once before stepping back. The rhythm of brushing soothed her, the warmth of the animal grounding her. For the first time, she felt a strange kind of peace, as though her body remembered what safety felt like. She smiled faintly, almost afraid of the expression on her own face. Daniel caught it but said nothing, only returning to his work. That moment, small as it was, planted something fragile between them. As the days grew longer, the ranch demanded more work. Daniel began teaching Clara small tasks: how to feed the chickens, how to gather eggs without fear of their pecking, how to pour grain for the horses. She fumbled at first, but he never scolded, only encouraged, his voice steady and patient. Slowly, she began to find her place. But healing was never a straight path. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, thunder cracking like cannon fire. The sound ripped Clara from sleep, dragging her back into memories of fists slamming against doors, of shouts echoing through the night. She bolted upright, gasping, clutching the blanket as if it might shield her. Her door creaked open, and Daniel stood there, lantern in hand, his eyes filled with concern. "It's just a storm," he said gently. But Clara's chest heaved, her breath shallow. No, she couldn't finish. Daniel crossed the room slowly, setting the lantern down. He didn't touch her, only crouched at a distance. "Look at me," he said firmly, his voice grounding. "You're here. You're not there anymore." Tears streamed down her face, but she met his gaze. The thunder roared again, and she flinched, but his eyes held her steady. Slowly, her breathing slowed, the terror easing as his presence anchored her. "I'll sit here until it passes," he said simply, settling into the chair by her bed. Clara stared at him through blurry eyes. No one had ever stayed for her nightmares before. She wanted to protest, to tell him he didn't have to, but the words stuck. Instead, she lay back, her tears drying, until exhaustion pulled her into sleep again. When she woke in the soft gray light of dawn, Daniel was still there, head tilted back, eyes closed in sleep. A warmth spread through her chest, fragile and unfamiliar. Trust. The bond between them deepened after that night. Clara began to speak more, sharing small pieces of her past. Not all at once, but enough that Daniel began to understand the weight she carried. She spoke of the man she had fled, of the cruelty that left her marked inside and out, of the hopelessness that nearly consumed her until she answered Daniel's letter. He listened without judgment, without pity, his hands folded, his gaze steady. When she faltered, he didn't press. When she wept, he let her. "You're stronger than you think," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, the stars above them endless. Clara shook her head, tears glistening. "Strong people don't break. You didn't break," he replied softly. "You survived. That's strength." The words struck deep, lodging in her heart. She had never thought of herself that way. The idea lingered, growing roots. Months passed, and Clara began to move through the ranch with ease, her laughter returning in soft bursts that startled even her. She found joy in small things, feeding Willow sugar cubes, baking bread in the kitchen, walking the fields at sunset. And Daniel found himself changed too. The silence of his ranch no longer felt heavy, but full. Her presence filled the empty corners of his life, her resilience inspiring something fierce and tender in him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, Daniel stood beside her by the fence. He reached for her hand, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Their fingers intertwined, rough calluses against soft skin. Clara looked up at him, her heart pounding, and for the first time, she did not feel fear in a man's closeness. She felt warmth. She felt home. The journey had not erased her scars, but together they had built something stronger than fear. A place of safety, a bond born of patience, and the first fragile steps toward love. And as the stars unfolded overhead, Clara knew one truth with certainty. She had come with him not because she had no other choice, but because, at last, she wanted to.